Okay, so thanks everyone for being here today. We have David Brazil, poet, translator, novelist, and pastor, here with us today. He was nominated, he's among his various uh, awards, he's been nominated for the California Book Award for his third book, Holy Ghost, published by City Lights in 2017. He has worked with Chika Okoye as the founding curator of Berkeley Art Museum's Black Life series that focuses on the cultural production of the African diaspora. He also is involved in doing the work, social justice work through the Faith Alliance for a Moral Economy. His most recent work is one that has a lot of Bancroft interest because he is published or a new edition of Philip Wayland's Scenes of Life at the Capitol. And he's going to talk to us today about Wayland's work and his work with Bancroft's collection. So with all due, please help me welcome David Brazil.
Thank you so much, Jose Adrian, and to all of you for being here and for the Bancrofts for inviting me to participate in this wonderful event. It's really delightful to see folks on the call that I know. Jason Morris and other friends are here, as well as some of the folks who made the book happen from WAVE. I see Heidi Broadhead, and I think I saw one of my other WAVE friends, Catherine Bressner in here. But yes, it's wonderful to get such a turnout for this event. So I wanted to just share a little bit about this work and Philip Wayland as a poet, and then kind of focus most of my time on sharing some archival materials. You know, I don't know what brings everybody here, if it's connections to the Bancroft or knowledge of Wayland, or, you know, so I want to make sure that this is, you know, interesting and valuable sort of no matter where you're coming from. But the Bancroft is very central to my work on this edition, and so I want to share with you some of the materials that I was able to unearth with the help of the wonderful reference librarians there. So as Jose Adrian said, I'm a poet, among other things, and you know, sort of an autodidact poet. Spent a lot of time working in bookstores and just learning from people, you know, in the community, especially since when I moved to California in 2005, just learning about the traditions, the lineages, the poets who had gone before, how it all connected. And one of the most important figures for that, you know, is Philip Wayland. And people come to Wayland a lot of different ways. A lot of people first encounter Wayland via one of his more famous friends, and he has a lot of famous friends. In fact, the biographer David Schneider, who wrote a very good biography called Crowded by Beauty, which I recommend if you're interested in Wayland's work, structures his biography around Wayland's friendships with people like Gary Snyder, Joanne Kiger, and certainly with Jack Kerouac. And many people first encounter Wayland in his pseudonym form in Kerouac's Dharma Bums, where he appears as a character called Warren Coughlin. And he's just kind of a sort of happy Zen mountain climber who lives in Berkeley. And that's Wayland, you know, and so people encounter him there. They may encounter him as part of a group of poets, which includes Gary Snyder and Lou Welch, who were from the Pacific Northwest, who met at Reed College in Portland and became friends through their mutual interest in literature, and kind of all ended up migrating down to California. Or they may encounter Wayland the other way because he was such an influential teacher and mentor to so many people who were younger than him, and particularly on an amazing generation of women poets. And I really talked with a lot of these folks in the course of doing the work on this book. So, you know, he was a mentor to Alice Notley, you know, one of the great living American poets, or poets writing in English, really. He was a mentor to Joanne Kiger. You know, he worked closely with Diane DePrima. So all of these people, and Leslie Scalapino was also deeply influenced by his work. And I think his work sheds a lot of light on her own work. All of this kind of creates the picture of a poet's poet, right? And this is true about Wayland. He is a poet's poet for all kinds of reasons. He has a sort of mix of goofiness and erudition that is a funny cocktail for a lot of people. It seems learned, but then he'll just throw in weird jokes. So the tone is kind of strange. He was never an academic, really. I mean, he went to school for literature, but he became very, very learned, again, through a sort of autodidact path. So he didn't become an academic and therefore create the conditions for the reception of his work in the way that, other authors have. And he wasn't especially concerned about his reputation, as far as we can tell. He was certainly ambitious as a writer. He wrote many books and published many books. And his journals indicate that he was indeed, sort of pursuing high aims as a writer. But his form of ambition was not really worldly in the way that it is for many other authors. And, after he returned from Japan, where he wrote Scenes of Life at the Capitol, that was the beginning of his path towards becoming a Zen monk, and the latter part of his life in relationship with the San Francisco Zen Center, which is how many people, people in San Francisco, many older folks knew Philip. I've met many folks associated with the Zen Center who, actually knew him, studied with him, heard him give Dharma talks. And his biographer, David Schneider, is actually somebody who met Philip through the Zen community, which gives the book a bit of a Zen spin, which is not bad, but it's a certain emphasis. And Philip is an interesting case of a poet who discovered religious vocation sort of later in life, and continued to write, but wrote less, with less perhaps pressure, and sort of accomplished his major work sort of prior to his religious devotion. And so, in the English tradition, we think of people like John Donne, and other kinds of, even Gerard Manley Hopkins, who appears in Scenes of Life at the Capitol, as other people kind of wrestling with religious vocation, in those cases, Christian religious vocation. But the analogs are definitely there. Actually, Donne is quoted in Scenes of Life as well. So many people are quoted. It's a very erudite poem. So this is the new edition of Scenes of Life that Wave put out. Is beautifully designed, and it comes out of about 5 years of work that I undertook starting in 2015. And the reason that I undertook this work is that I wanted to understand something about this particular poem, Scenes of Life at the Capitol. It's a book-length poem that Wayland wrote during his second sojourn. He lived twice in Japan, and the second time he lived and taught. He was teaching English and taught in Kyoto, and sort of wrote this poem. And many people admire this poem. I think it's the high watermark of his work, and one of the great book-length poems in the 20th century in English. But it again remains kind of a cult artifact. So, my first interest in even delving into materials before I got the idea for a book project is just that I wanted to understand something about how Wayland worked, about his method in composing this mysterious poem. I'll just read y'all the opening page of the poem, so that if for whatever reason you are in this talk and not familiar with Wayland, you get a little bit of an idea of his combination of erudition, imagism, and zaniness. So this is the beginning of Scenes of Life at the Capitol. Having returned at last and being carefully seated on the floor, somebody else's floor as usual, far away across that ocean which looked through Newport windows years ago, somebody else's living room, another messed up, weedy garden, tall, floppy, improbably red flowers, all the leaves turned over in the rain, ridged, furry scrotum veins. Hedge, glisten, tile, roof, tin, roof, telephone pole, decoratively tormented black pine, slowly repeating its careful program, endlessly regretting, but here is original, done once, not to be reproduced, nor electronically remembered. Loosen up, festoon. An enormous drop of pure water suddenly there, right in the center of preceding page. Nothing can be done about that. The line was ruined. Okay, belt hair, a band is funnier. Bar Kochba, do something about it. Like Animal Factory Mayhem. So that's page 1, and it goes from there. And so I just wanted to understand something about what is up with this crazy poem. And I knew from talking to people that Wayland's work was at the Bancroft, that his notebooks were at the Bancroft, and I also knew from some writing that had been done by Leslie Scalapino that that he had a specific working method that involved engaging with his notebooks. That is to say, and Leslie writes about this in, the great poet, late poet Leslie Scalapino writes about this in her book called How Phenomena Appear to Unfold, which was republished in the past few years by Litmus Press, and is really one of the only critical engagements with Wayland's work. And she was friends with Wayland. And she talks with him and quotes him saying that he would just kind of take his notebooks and kind of move them around on the floor and take a little bit from here and a little bit from there, and that's how he wrote his work, right? And he's being a little flip and perhaps a little misleading about his method, making it seem like it's a little random. And I just wanted to understand something about like what was the relationship between the original notebooks that Wayland wrote in and the final poem. Like, how do we get from this to that? And that began with just going to the Bancroft and looking at those notebooks. So now if the machine will let me, I'm going to share my screen and show you some of what I found at the Bancroft. Okay, so hopefully this is sharing. Does everybody see? Fred, is that music? Okay, great. So this is a page from Wayland's notebooks, and it's a line that repeats a number of times as a motif in the poem. Fred is that music. And he riffs on it and jokes on it. And this is a riff and a joke, as many of you will recognize, on John Keats's Ode on a Nightingale, which includes the line, "Fled is that music, do I wake or sleep?" So for Wayland, it's Fred, comma, is that music? And then he riffs on do I wake or sleep, do I fake or leap, and various other punning riffs on that. So this is kind of an emblem of the book. And this is written as big as it looks. He wrote it in huge letters on one of these pages. So it's pretty funny. So that's just the beginning of the slideshow. But this is one of the notebooks from 1969. It's a Japanese brand of notebook. The Bancroft has many boxes of Wayland's archive. It's not all of it, Wayland's archive. Some of it, his archive is in Columbia in New York. And I also visited that archive. But the bulk of it is at the Bancroft, and the core of the work that forms Scenes of Life is at the Bancroft. And it reaches back to his early life. There are notebooks from the 40s, and they're, sketchbooks and all kinds of materials, and then stretches, of course, forward into the 80s and 90s and his time in the Zen community. But when he was in Japan, the second time, he discovered this brand of Japanese notebooks, which are these cloth-bound hardcover notebooks that with a tie, as you can see, they're very beautiful. And he just really liked them. And most of these writings were in these notebooks. So a lot of what I did after my initial incursions to discover this material and how amazing it was, and then kind of beginning to develop an idea for how to use this to research and do a new edition, and discussing that with Wave, I just took a lot of photos of this stuff so I could have it for reference for the prose writing that I was working on, because one of the big projects of this edition was both to recirculate this poem, which has been out of print in a standalone edition for decades. You can sometimes find the 1971 Gray Fox edition in used bookstores, but that is not yeah, that's not great for people who don't live in places with used bookstores, or good used bookstores. So we wanted to have a new edition so the book would be more readily available. But also, you know, I really wanted to sort of do tribute to Wayland by lifting up his work and adding to the almost non-existent critical literature about his work. So as opposed to other figures of his generation, which again include Kerouac, Gary Snyder, Allen Ginsberg, who's the dedicatee of Scenes of Life and who was a close friend of Wayland. You know, as opposed to those people who are well known, whose work has been, you know, written about critically, almost nothing exists critically on Wayland, which is shocking. You know, literature survey that I did kind of revealed that that remains the case, and most of what is written about Wayland is pretty much written about him in light of his relationship to more famous friends, specifically often Gary Snyder. And that does a disservice, I think, to Wayland's work. So I wanted to also write a critical engagement and an essay, which is the afterword of the Wave book, that would help to situate this poem in the context of the American long poem that, you know, sort of begins in some ways with Leaves of Grass, Whitman's Leaves of Grass, but certainly continues into Ezra Pound's cantos and William Carlos Williams Patterson, both of which were specific touchstones for Wayland in his composition. So we'll just go through these notebook pages and see what we see. So yeah, you see Kyoto, and you also see Wayland's unique dating system, which some contemporary poets, including Clark Coolidge and Jason Morris, who's on the call, take up this dating system. And you also see Wayland's handwriting. And Wayland has this really unique, here's the first page of this notebook, this really, I would say unique is actually the wrong adjective. It's not unique, it's beautiful, but it's actually a stereotyped Renaissance calligraphic hand that Wayland learned from a teacher called Lloyd Reynolds, who taught literature and also calligraphy at Reed. And Wayland always wrote in this handwriting. It was just he just taught himself to write it, and he always wrote this way. And it means that looking at his notebooks and reading them is a pure delight, as opposed to reading the manuscripts of so many authors who have crabbed and impossible to read handwriting like myself. But Wayland always wrote in this beautiful hand. So if you ever get a chance to go to the Bancroft and check this out, I strongly encourage you to examine the archive. It's just like such a pleasure. And this is actually a handwriting that you can see. Gary Snyder learned this handwriting from Lloyd Reynolds. So you can see this in some of his work. And also, Joanne Kiger taught herself this, I think, when she was hanging out with all these people. So she showed me examples of her handwriting that she had practiced. That is, again, this same hand, right? So this notebook just starts, and you know, he's writing about whatever he writes about. There's quotations from things. There's riffs and little jokes. At the bottom of this page, you see "Gli onesti tarde," which is a line from Dante, which is also quoted in Pound's cantos. So there's all these like little things that are kind of just floating around in his mind. You also see all these doodles with color. He had these Pentel ink color pens that he really liked and used to sketch. And we reproduced some of this in the Wave edition, but it's in black and white, but there's very vibrant color in the manuscripts. And so in some ways, you know, Wayland was just doing takes, right? And he used this language that Kerouac also uses of a so-called prose take, like a take in a movie, that you sort of capture what's in front of you, and you don't necessarily know what you're going to do with it when you get it. You know, some filmmakers say, experimental filmmakers say, shoot first and ask questions later, right? So Wayland has a notebook practice where he's just kind of writing and not that worried about what the writing is for, trusting that like what needs to happen is going to bubble out of the writing, right? So that's a lot of this writing is just like, you know, whatever he was thinking about. And then all of a sudden you get to this page where you see this the dating of this time in 1969. And this ends up being the day that that Scenes of Life commences. And here is a bit of how it appears in the manuscript, the bit I just read to you. Loosen up, festoon. And then an enormous drop of pure water suddenly appeared to the right of the center on the preceding page. Nothing can be done about that. The line was ruined. Okay. So this appears on the first page, but it doesn't appear in quite this way, right? He's changed the wording, he's added materials, he's intercut stuff, and he's omitted stuff. And this is how the question of omission in particular was really interesting to me, which is why I ended up titling the essay that I wrote, Curious Elision, right? And so Curious Elision is another one of these motifs in the poem, like Fred is that music. And there are a bunch of different motival features. And in poetry, you know, a lot of people associate the idea of the motival with Wagner and musical motif. But in poetry, especially in longer poems in the 20th century, you know, many of which kind of take inspiration from Ezra Pound, there's a motival structure where things repeat to give a kind of form to the work. And so there are various motifs that structure scenes of life and the apparent kind of chaos, busyness, and jokiness of scenes of life. And I try to write about this some in the essay. But one of those is Curious Elision. And Curious Elision is, maybe you can hear a pun on the Greek that is found in the Catholic Mass of Kyrie eleison, right? Which means in the Mass they say, Kyrie eleison, Christe eleison, Kyrie eleison. Lord have mercy, Christ have mercy, Lord have mercy. But for Wayland, the Kyrie eleison becomes Curious Elision. And he recurs to that pun over and over again. And so for me, one of the curious elisions was, how did he choose what to omit from his manuscript? And then, of course, it turns out that the theme of the curious elision is one of the motifs, not just because the phrase reoccurs, but because so much of the poem is about gaps. It's about omissions. It's about what the Buddhist tradition calls shunyata, or the void, right? That is actually what existence consists in. Once we see through the realm of aggregates that we, you know, are hypnotized by in our attachment, according to, you know, the Buddhist tradition. You know, he quotes Rochester's poem, on nothing. And so the theme of nothing and the elision and the gap is one, and the void is one that's really thematic, but not in a bummer way, more in a joyful way. So that's Loosen Up Festoon. And then on the next page, you know, it continues, and then we see with this enormous red rubricated capital, having arrived at last and having been carefully seated on the floor, and he goes into this prose, which then becomes versified in the book and actually starts the book, and that's the first word of the book is having, right? And so there's this interesting way that like the beginning of the poem is not the beginning, or the poem has two beginnings. And in my study of this poem, I kind of always think of it as having two beginnings. One is the real first line of having returned at last. And then, you know, we can talk about what it means to start what word starts a long poem, because that always turns out to be an important question. So in this case, having. But then the sort of second beginning, almost like the two creations in the book of Genesis, is loosen up, festoon, right? Which is like the moment where you realize you haven't actually started things in the right way, and you say, okay, wait a minute, let me try this again. Like when a poet stumbles on the second line of the poem, and they're like, okay, wait, let me try it again, you know? And so the loosen up festoon is like that moment for Wayland, but it's also like, wait a minute, this is already too uptight. There's a great funny moment in the earliest recordings of Elvis Presley in Sun Studios, where he, you know, the band starts and then he breaks in and says, wait a minute, guys, this isn't doing anything for me. Let's play this real gone. And then they start the tune again. And it's a put on, you know, you can tell that it's kind of made up studio dialogue, but it's still kind of funny to hear, you know, that restart of the song. So that's kind of what happens there. And then, you know, we continue, and now we're kind of going to be in the body of the poem. And for those of you who are students of the poem, you'll probably see elements of it that you recognize as we go through these pages, like another master said, well, you can always take more, you know. But what you will see in this poem, in the manuscripts rather, that you won't see in the finished poem, first of all, the dates, right? Because this is a journal. It's a sort of an unorthodox journal. It's not a day book exactly. Wayland had a separate notebook where he kept his expenses, his car fare, and eating out, because he was on a tight budget. He was always poor, and kind of always impecunious, and like extravagant when he had money, and like flat broke and often starving and depending upon his friends to give him food when he didn't have money, which is part of how he got to be close friends with so many folks in San Francisco, especially, was living with them, including Michael McClure, who he lived with at different times in the 50s. And got to know McClure's family, his daughter, and McClure was the one. And Wayland quotes Michael McClure, recently passed, God rest his soul, in saying that, Philip, they should really publish your drawings and your doodles and your handwriting, right? And so many of Wayland's books reproduce this handwriting in parts, and often he designed the covers. But it's really something to see the whole work with his care, again, where you see the capitals like the N and nevertheless and the giant my, and then all the doodles and sketches that of course don't make it into the final book, except for there's one that makes it in the final book, and maybe we'll get a chance to see that. And then, yeah, this amazing kind of bird, and a lot of this just continues with poetry about his time in the Army. Wayland served in the Army, and he talks a bit about that. And again, most of this text ends up being included, and you see even illustrations for a part of the poem as a wasp in the bookshelves rejects, and then Wayland gives you a tour of his bookshelf in Kyoto via wasp. Wasp in the bookshelves rejects Walt Whitman, Herman Melville, Emily Dickinson, the Goliard poets, a Vedic reader, Lama Govinda, medieval French verses and romances, long discourses of the Buddha, and the principal Upanishads. The window glass reads more entertainingly, but soon she leaves that for the foxtail grass, the camellia hedge, the dull mid-morning sun, right? And so this is a kind of like beautiful, well-observed, naturalistic passage. The poem is really full of that value that Wayland got both through Pound and Pound's imagism and direct presentation of the image, as well as the values from William Carlos Williams, who actually met as a young man, and who was a big influence on him. And even Williams's kind of no ideas but in things, you also see in the way that Wayland often creates these beautiful, perfectly observed little scenes. And those two are parts of Scenes of Life at the Capitol, right? The title of the book. So, continuing, you get a sense of, how much different kind of stuff here became the raw material in the quarry for his work. And then you even see pages that he's explicitly marked cancel, and he says, this is not to be included. And these are pages that don't get included. It's when he, went back over the notebook at some point in between the composition of the original pages and the redaction into some form of the drafts of Scenes of Life. And so Scenes of Life actually went through several drafts, beginning with these raw material manuscripts and then proceeding into typescripts that were published in magazines. So there are several magazine publications which are mentioned in the acknowledgments, and I dug all of those up. And then there are the typescripts that were used by Donald Allen, his friend Donald Allen, who published Gray Fox, to prepare the final edition that came out in 1971 of Scenes of Life at the Capitol. And each one of those indicates, a different level of Wayland's own clarification of his work. I mean, I think he learned continuously through reflection and looking at his work. And in the acknowledgments to the Gray Fox edition, he says, seeing what some of this material would look like in print was a great help to me in cutting and revising the manuscript for this present version. And so that's in his acknowledgement to the magazine editors. And so, it changed. And honestly, I had enough material gathered between the Bancroft and Columbia and other sources to really prepare something like a variorum edition of Wayland's work on Scenes of Life. But ultimately, you know, in conversations with Wave, we decided that what would be the most valuable would really be a trade edition and a really readable edition that we didn't want to bury under too much archival and manuscript evidence. And then we also didn't want to bury under too much erudition. You know, the poem could be fully annotated. Every line could be annotated in the same manner as, for example, Carol Terrell's volume Companion to Pound's Cantos, which gives you glosses on references and overall intertexts, and the similar work of George Butterick on Charles Olson's Maximus poems. And, you know, even though Wayland's poem is shorter and it's sort of less ponderous, it's still just as full of complex interwoven reference, literary references, going from Homer up to his friends, but also including everything in between, again, from John Donne and Hopkins and Rochester to, you know, John Skelton and many less well-known English poets who were really important to Wayland, and he enjoyed picking out some of their interesting bits. But yeah, this cancel page is kind of just reflecting on his mother's religious life. His mother was a Christian Scientist, and that's kind of the only religious path that Wayland was on. You know, he wasn't on it. He was raised in it and kind of had no interest in it, as being kind of incoherent from his point of view. And, you know, he kind of began to engage with Buddhism as early as the 50s, but it really took him a while to sort of commit to the practice. So yeah, these are further canceled pages. And some are censored. So that's really funny. You can see a couple in flagrante delicto on the bottom left under the censored banner. So this is also kind of funny because, you know, there isn't a lot of sex, sexuality, romance in Wayland's writing, as opposed to, say, Allen Ginsberg, who, you know, had no problem writing poems dedicated to one-night stands and so forth. And in fact, prided himself on queer, you know, introducing and blazing a trail for queer material. So, you know, there's an ongoing conversation about, like, what was Wayland's sexuality. He didn't really have a life partner. He was never really observed to date or make these connections with people. And one of the claims I make in the afterword is that, in a way, the poem is dedicated or centers around his sort of unrequited passion for Joanne Kiger. And he was friends with Joanne. He's older than Joanne. And in sort of some manuscript evidence that I tease out in detail in the afterword, I kind of make a connection between a flip out that he has in the poem and actually preserved correspondence that between him and Joanne, where she, you know, basically indicates that she's getting remarried, and he is upset by this and kind of realizes that he's more upset than he should be because he has some feelings that he hasn't copped to. And I was able to do some of that research through access to some of Wayland's letters that were loaned to me by the poet Cedar Saigo, who's thanked in the acknowledgments, along with a lot of other poets who are Wayland lovers. So again, you know, the capitals and the elaborate stuff that makes in the text, Rudy Toot, we're the boys from the Institute, and school day stuff. Sorry about the 90-degree rotation on the pages, but you all get the sense, I think. And you know, just more cancels, drawings, and here's where he talks about nothing, and nothing is so important that he puts a border around it, and, you know, has this whole conversation that ends up in the poem. And then he goes into the "oh mighty nothing," which is, and then he says, "how does the wicked Earl begin?" And that, of course, that's the Earl of Rochester, who is best known, if you know, most people apart from English majors don't really know who the Earl of Rochester is, but if you do study Rochester in school or as an autodidact, he's mostly famous for really filthy poems about impotence and sex that kind of vie with the Marquis de Sade in terms of, like, I don't know, maybe not vileness, but vulgarity. But so this is a poem that's dedicated to nothing, which ends up in the poem, and this is really funny. and then there's this, sort of humorous and a bit lubricious afterword, which is lettered here and makes it into the poem. Gong! And Waylon loves sound effects, almost like the 60s Batman fight sequences with the bizarre intertitles. Waylon is so full of those kind of weird sounds. And there's some really funny ones in this poem. But one of them is gong, elevation of the weenie. And right, this is ultimately like a pretty scatological and actually blasphemous moment, because he's sort of referring to, this theme that goes through the poem of the Mass. And we talked about curious elision, but there's one of the crucial moments in the Mass is the elevation, Catholic Mass, the elevation of the host. And here he's talking about basically getting an erection, and is talking about that in the aftermath of talking about the Earl of Rochester. So he was not totally desexed, despite what some people seem to think about his work. And so, another thing you'll see a lot here, and this gets more as he goes. Waylon, was studying Japanese to speak it, but he was also studying the writing system. He was studying classical Chinese, and he was also studying Sanskrit. And so, this is stuff that he would continue to be engaged with through his, Zen practice. But so because of those studies, these notebooks are often kind of places to practice his other calligraphy, which is the calligraphy of the ideograms of classical Chinese, as well as the Japanese characters that are based on it. And some of those end up in the poem as which is also like sort of homage or intertext of Pound, who is notorious for sort of including Chinese in the cantos, but we'll probably come across some of those, and I also, we'll wrap it up shortly because I want to make sure that we have time for some questions, and there is so much to talk about in this poem. I hope if there's one outcome of this that you will get a copy and read it, because it is a marvelous poem. I always consider it a holograph. There's so much in it, and every time you see a new thing, I've read it, dozens and dozens of times, and every time there's something new. Wave recorded a wonderful group reading that you can listen to via Wave, and I think Wave's YouTube, that I did with a bunch of other poets, and also Waylon's recording, not of the entire poem, but of maybe about half of the poem, is available on PenSound, so you can check that out. And I just wanted to stop here because here you see on the left hand, if you can read it, Obit Jean-Louis, really Jack, but Jean-Louis Kerouac. So he's marking the death day of Jack Kerouac. And that shows up in the poem. He doesn't include it written this way. He says, Jack dead in Florida. And also, it marks the time, a time of grief and mourning. And of course, this is also the time, this is written in 1969, as you can see, have been able to see. So it's also during the sort of the height of the Vietnam War. And so it's a poem that's also about the losses and the violence of Vietnam, which of course is not that far away from Waylon writing in Japan. And it's a meditation on American empire and the American capital, as well as Kyoto and other world capitals. And just thinking about what it means to sort of be living out and through the war and all the violences. Kent State happens while Waylon is in Kyoto, and he writes about that too. In many ways, the poem sort of creates a time traveling possibility for us, because we begin to tune into what it was like to live through the moments. And here you see some of his practice in the Chinese writing, and he has some glosses beneath the characters on the right-hand page of what they mean. And often he'll have his Chinese cued to Matthew's, the sort of principal Chinese dictionary that's available. And some of those poems, and there's some Sanskrit characters. You can see him practicing his Sanskrit characters. It seems like he made more progress on his Chinese than on his Sanskrit. And these amazing drawings and more of the void. but I just want to find a page if I can with the only sketch that he includes, as well as the some of the Chinese characters that he includes. So he has a wonderful part where he includes it, and there's Ganesh. He includes a self-portrait, and he's drowning in the word ocean, and that image is reproduced in the original edition. And let me see if we can find that. You can see my big hand getting in the way. So what? Oh, that's a still from I Am Curious Yellow, which is a kind of famous highbrow, yeah, erotic film. So he, for whatever reason, he was preoccupied with that. And this is Tanuki, who's a character from Japanese myth who shows up towards the end of the poem, and a minotaur. I mean, there's just so many charming sort of jeu d'esprit drawings. But yeah, let me just find this word ocean image just because it's really funny. There it is. Okay. So this is a wonderful 2-page spread where you see these ideograms and that he's working on, and some of this text ends up in the poem as well as some of the images. And he says, he has this great line, while I rummage 3 dictionaries, 4 different texts, 3 languages, all of them incomprehensible. And then he has this line, minestrone for all sentient beings. And then this verse that ends up, get me out of here, bail me out of the word ocean. And that word ocean is just kind of almost Poundian gloss on this character, Tsu. And you see Tsu is the Wade Giles transliteration. The number 2 after it means that it's the second tone in Chinese. And then M6984 is the number that it's keyed to in Matthews's dictionary. And then a picture of Waylon, drowning in the word ocean, followed by this, take on an old folk song, I wish to God I never see your face nor hear your lion tongue. And, it's a really goofy pun, obviously, on lying and lion. But, Waylon never minded a goof. And so I think that bail me out of the word ocean is a perfectly good place to conclude. And I thank you all for your attention to this. And I would love to, converse with you about any questions you have.
Thank you, David. That was wonderful. I'm going to stop the recording just so that people feel they want to feel more comfortable when speaking directly to this. But thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you.